so many things. And sorry, I just got an interruption about the meeting being recorded.
That was me. I apologize. I always forget to do this at the very beginning, and we're 10 minutes into it, and I've forgotten to do that. I'm sorry.
And my other one remark would be, I think that to do this, we all have to start recognizing our own positionality and our own privilege. And privilege can be ability-based, privilege can be economic, privilege can be, so many people read White Fragility for the Diversity Forum. We have to think ourselves about our own positionality. We have to educate ourselves before we can do so much else, would be my other broad opening comment. I think you have some other hands there, John.
Yeah, I see Tom. Go ahead, Tom.
Thanks. I know most of you, but for those of you who don't know me, my name's Tom Tobin. I'm with the Learning Design, Development, and Innovation Group over in the Division of Continuing Studies. And one of the things that was really important when Don and I put together that knowledge base on equity and inclusion was that you've all heard 872 best practices for how to lower barriers, how to make your environments more welcoming, more helping students to feel a part of your conversations rather than apart from them. But we can really get to feeling like, you know, we're suffering from analysis paralysis. There's so many things that we should be doing, so many changes that we need to make yesterday that we kind of just look at it and say, I don't know where to start. I don't know what to do. So even in the activity sheet, there's a mountain of stuff. There's lots of resources there. And I'd encourage everybody to unpack that later. And maybe we can use our time today to figure out one thing and to take that forest of 800 things and turn it into what's one way that you want to start and one way that you can build on good foundations that you're already using.
Great. And go ahead, Don.
Thanks, John. And just to build on what Tom and Jennifer were saying, I think when I think about inclusive teaching, there are all of the different structural elements that go into a course. And then it really comes down to building relationship. And how do you work to build relationship with students, with colleagues? And it's as simple as thinking about the way you introduce yourself on the first day of class, the way you ask students to introduce themselves to one another, and then you get into the considerations for design before and beyond that. But for me, it's relationship is just so key.
Great. All right. Anyone else? Both the folks that I've invited here to help present, but also any participants. Go ahead, AJ.
Yeah, I was looking at the framework that you had at the top on inclusive teaching, and that first bullet on empathy and humility. I think, you know, given the current context of the pandemic, I think that is probably the lens that is the biggest for me right now, is making sure that I practice empathy and humility. And, you know, sharing with my students, you know, the very first class, that even though it's graduate school and I recognize that there's a, you know, that I'm here to try to uncover that hidden curriculum for them. I don't want this to be a gotcha, right? There's no question is a bad question. And I'm here to unmask that hidden curriculum, and I'm invested in their success. And then also just sharing my own experiences with my own minoritized identities, being open and upfront about my own journey, you know, navigating graduate school, and I didn't have it all figured out. I think sharing my own examples, I think is important. So that empathy and humility piece, and especially in the online environment where, you know, students are checking in on their kids during class, you know, and just recognizing that this is a welcoming space that they don't need to worry about if their child pops in, during class. Yeah.
I think this is great. The idea that, and it was like this for me when I was in undergrad and graduate school. School is a competitive place and only the best survive, right? And so we are taught from the get-go to sort of do our own work and don't share and don't help other people. And it's this really competitive space. And it doesn't have to be, and I would say that it shouldn't be that. So how do we set the culture in our classrooms, in our learning environments, so that our students don't spend their whole time wondering what is the hidden curriculum? Where is the gotcha going to come out from and surprise me? Is it going to be from other students? Is it going to be from ourselves? So yes, I love the idea of modeling sort of, and I don't do it all the time on purpose, but I model making mistakes a lot. Like I mess up and, things happen, and that's okay. Part of what I want my students and people who can learn from me is that it's okay to do that. And maybe we'll all get better at recovering from those, and we'll get better at, so that we don't have as many terrible high stakes mistakes that we have to work through. Great. And Anjali, I see that your hand is still raised. Is there anything else you'd like to add, or?
Sorry.
All right.
Didn't.
No worries. All right. I did use the Wisconsin experience as sort of the framework for this, because I think that there's a lot of really wonderful stuff in, empathy and humility, relentless curiosity, purposeful action, and intellectual confidence that sort of sets a standard both in modeling and asking our students to demonstrate that we can use from that framework. Universal design, which you'll see at the bottom of the page, is another great framework, offering choices for people to build on the strengths that they have, on their values, on their interests, on their prior experiences. If we can connect our content to their lives, let me rephrase that. If we can get them to connect our content to their lives, then we've included them. Then they can start to feel like this is my content now, not just something that's being foisted on me in some ways. All right, should we start going through this table of this chart here? And I will always invite any of the participants to please jump in if to clarify a question that you might have had, or if somebody wrote a question here and you're like, oh, and I have a follow-up question to that. You can either type it in, you could type it into the chat, you can raise your hand, or you can just unmute and interrupt us. All of those ways, those are multiple means for you to express your interest and participation. So, all right, we've got the first question. Are synchronous courses or are asynchronous or synchronous courses more inclusive? Anyone want to jump in and unmute and address that?
Sure.
All right.
I'm happy to.
Is that it? Is that Angela? Come on.
It's Jennifer.
Yep, go ahead, Jennifer.
Do I have audio? Okay.
Yes.
I think Tom typing designed well, they can be equally inclusive. That being said, asynchronous interactions are by their nature less restrictive. The biggest barrier is the clock. So I think there's no one answer to this. And I was about to type, there are affordances for people with disabilities. What I would have to go through to get into a building on the UW campus, to argue with paratransit, to argue about the curb cut, then your elevator's broken, the number of times I have to call facilities versus what I can just fix in the learning management system myself. But it's not always like that. For some users with other disabilities, it's harder to learn, even in a well-designed online environment. And so I think if we can think about the affordances of each one and how to, if somebody can come up with one really good example of this, maybe to stick to Tom's, what's one point? What are the affordances? And so then how do we build on those affordances so that we don't have a deficit mentality of what we've lost? Instead, we're talking about what we've gained. And I think that'll be very useful as we go into more blended learning, that concept now of high flex learning, of going back and forth in any way possible. I wonder if anyone has one affordance that they found that you think, oh, well, I'll probably go back to a classroom, but, oh, I'm sorry, I misread this question. It said, are synchronous or asynchronous online courses more inclusive? I didn't see online.
I think it's okay to broaden that.
The first part of that was silly, but I think it still holds for what I said with people with disabilities. There are going to be obstacles to each that we would not necessarily expect. I would expect asynchronous to be a lot easier for many cases in which the students have told me, actually it isn't, because my problem is sorting through this information, wayfinding, no matter how well designed it is. I have a difficult time asking questions. I can't see visual feedback in the discussion forum, so I don't know. So, those would be some things people who might have more experience than I do working with non-neurotypical learners could speak to as well. But I think there are pros and cons of each, and I would still challenge everybody to think of some affordances. What's the good? Never waste a good crisis.
Go ahead, Angela.
Hi. Yeah, I think the point that was made in the document that both asynchronous and synchronous can be inclusive, but it does come down to the design. And this semester, I'm in a fun, unique position where I'm running a lab course online 100% where we have 2 synchronous sessions a week. And then one's like an hour and the other's an hour to 2, sort of depending on how much time we use. And then I'm also running a totally asynchronous seminar section. So I'm getting to do both, I guess, which is exciting. But I think part of that design is, because for me, I think about kind of 2 main things, which is like participation, the ability to participate, and then also community or connectedness in terms of trying to like make an environment inclusive. So if it is totally asynchronous, I think having an option, a synchronous option at some point is maybe a way to kind of draw people in if they're struggling on the totally asynchronous side. So for the seminar class, for example, each student is creating a video. So I meet with each individual student the week before their seminar presentation, because there's a lot of just like little things and worries that aren't going to translate well if I write them an email to explain everything. So kind of having that where we do like a really hands-on session, I'm hoping that helps with that. And then on the flip side, with a synchronous session, it's really important to make sure you try to have, I kind of hate the term high flex, but because I don't always know what it means, but having something where whatever that activity is in the synchronous session, there's an extension of that people that can't be there for whatever reason are able to still participate in a way that extends their own knowledge and gets them a chance to kind of do the activity and maybe even, I don't know, connect with other students. So sorry, I'm rambling here. But the other thing that in the back of my mind, I did like a pre-course survey where I was asking what students were looking ahead to, what's something positive they were thinking about for the semester. And there were a fair number of people who were just generally jazzed that they were going to have synchronous sessions because they felt they missed that a lot and they just wanted a chance to like see or even just hear another person. And so trying to fit in the student perspective when we're thinking about that could be helpful. Hopefully there was useful stuff in there. It smells like banana bread in my apartment right now, so I'm really struggling on focusing. But
it's about options, right? It's about giving them options. And I think, to build on Jennifer's point about let's not lose the opportunities in this crisis. We are learning so much still that there is no is one better than the other. They both have, as the point that was made, pros and cons. They all have affordances. And I think that if we're good at this, we can pull from the best of online space and bring it into our synchronous face-to-face spaces. And we can pull from the best of our face-to-face in-person learning and bring it into the tools that we use in our remote or online, both synchronous and asynchronous spaces. And the tools aren't always the best right now. And they're not the best because we didn't have this situation before, but they're going to get better. And we're hopefully going to get better tools that have better affordances for that, for all those situations. Don, go ahead. And then I see that we've got AJ and somebody else online there had their hands up as well.
Thanks, John. In this context, I think of social presence, and I'm thinking about the community of inquiry model by Garrison and colleagues. And social presence for me is thinking about when I walk into a physical classroom, I get to see students' faces. If we're using name tense, I get to read their names. I see where they are in the room. And thinking about how do you translate that into the online space, whether it's synchronous or asynchronous. And so for a synchronous setting, one of the things I've done in a course is the first slide has everybody's picture up for a smaller course. And so as you come into the virtual space, you see everybody's face, and it's the best approximation for me to walking into a classroom and seeing your peers. I think about providing audio feedback on assignments for students as another way of connecting with them, giving them opportunities to work with one another, and encouraging the use of audio and video in those spaces for collaboration and things like that. So I think that building those relationships through the different types of affordances of the technology is an important piece.
Great. And then AJ? Cannot hear you yet. You got to unmute too.
Oh, sorry, I didn't realize I was on mute. Whether it's synchronous or asynchronous, I found that I have to build in a lot more check-ins, like with my students. For assignments, I have like I map out. Okay, this is due. This part of the assignment is due this time, and then you're going to meet with me and check in with me about it. I build in a lot of check-ins with each of my assignments because I'm realizing in the online space sometimes students don't often receive the instructions or aren't often things aren't necessarily translated. I don't know if they're hearing or whether or not they're receiving the information. So I personally need those check-ins as well to make sure that they're receiving the information. So yeah, a lot of check-ins built in. I think is really important.
Over communicate because we don't know what their situation is, and we might think that we don't need that, but somebody in your class needs that extra nudge of something's happening because they've got other things happening in their life that we need that stuff. I want to get to Peter and then Tom after you, okay? Or yeah. Peter, you had your hand up at one point. Go ahead.
Yes, I did. I wanted to make a couple of points. And so for one, I kind of like in a bigger class that you put in the timetable beforehand as being asynchronous, for example, I feel guilty of, in the semester itself and say, well, it would be nice to have a synchronous session, maybe not all synchronous sessions, but once in a while, maybe once a week or something. So that's kind of like one experience I had in going from last semester to this semester, for example. Another one is kind of like in synchronous sessions, I found it extremely useful to remind people you know, what we're trying to achieve and what is, you know, like elaborating on what Donald said before, what we're trying to achieve in terms of recreating an in-person environment remotely, you know, and so I remind them of, well, you know, if we were in person in the room itself, we would look at each other, we could see each other, we can talk to each other. And so we can do that here too. It's just a different mindset that you try to cultivate. So those were two things that I was thinking of.
Yeah, great. Tom and then Jennifer.
Thanks. And Peter, you're setting up another idea about how to increase the inclusion and the equity in our remote teaching spaces. Because the flip side of the coin is that even though having synchronous sessions, we think of them as a not the same replacement for our face-to-face interactions. One of the things that we have to realize is that in a face-to-face environment, we're not looking at one another all the time. And so Zoom fatigue is a real thing. You know, so if your students don't have their cameras on, I noticed there was a question in the document about that as well, then that could be for many different reasons. John mentioned a few of them. You know, you don't want to have your camera on because you don't want to show your background, or you've been in an abusive relationship previously and you don't want your image out there. There's lots of different reasons why students might want to have a little bit more privacy in those those real-time conversations with us. But Peter, you put your finger on something important, and that is when we are using technology to mediate our communication, whether that's in a face-to-face environment where we have slides and we're working on, showing students things in our classrooms using real materials, all the way up to asynchronous online stuff in Canvas and everywhere in between. The thing that we can think about, that sort of one thing that I want to take away myself, is how are my students perceiving their role? And one of the things that you mentioned is just listening to your students. You know, if you want to have a synchronous session, a real-time session with them, ask them, would this be useful? Can you attend? For those of you who can't attend, how can we get you that information and make you feel like you are a part of? That can be hard when you're teaching a 500-person introductory class. At the same time, getting the word out there that this is a space for you and you belong, that's kind of step zero for us. So I wanted to highlight something that Peter had said and maybe take the conversation a little further.
Great. And then Jennifer, and then we should move on to the next one, or we'll never get through any of this. You have to unmute, Jennifer.
I'm called in through my phone. I'm sorry. So the
I
controls are
see.
not working.
There you are. We
quite
hear you now.
as I expected. So I never think of a well-designed online class as replicating a face-to-face classroom. I think of the affordances, what do I have online? And to me, it's magic, pedagogical magic, what things I could do that I never could have done face-to-face. I did put EDUCAUSE's remote instruction versus well-designed online article here to reference, but the handout that I prepared for today really, I think, takes a step back from where Tom was talking about. You have 500 students, you want to ask, it's hard to ask, but I want to frame that through a larger question of asking. And mine was titled, Asking is an Obstacle to Inclusion, Instructional Design and Information Equity is Social Justice. But Tom's example of, we want to, before, you don't want to just announce the synchronous class, you want to ask the students, what else could we do if you can't be there? So that, how do we design things so that we are in a posture of listening, and that the burden of asking is not put on the student with disabilities and 6 different accommodation letters to take to 6 different professors and 5 different TAs, so that the student who needs religious accommodation doesn't feel excuse me, busy professor, but rather busy professor has already said, let me know, please let me know. So that if there are instances where students might need to follow up with us, if you have a student with a hearing impairment, you're frequently asked to ask the student how things are going, if you're doing things that are not, that you're instinctive, turning your head in a certain way. It's a lot easier for the student if you say, okay, in 1 week, I'm going to plan to follow up with you. Please feel free to follow up with me yourself before then, so that there's some instructor initiated communication. And I think we can design that in so that we have this posture of we are listening, we've asked. You're not having to ask us, you're asking a question, you're answering a question that's already been asked that demonstrates concern for your needs. So I think this applies to a lot of the scenarios that came up, a way of thinking about that dynamic.
I want to jump in here and I think we're talking about the inclusive practices for larger classes. When we do see these circumstances, so Melissa has one that Tom gave a +1 to, using polls and surveys in your large class. And you know, an easy way to do this is just to have them in your everyday assignments at the last thing. How did this work? What could have been better or worse about that? Make that a question worth 1 point, you know, so they'll answer it, but not a yay or nay, right or wrong answer thing. And then just use that feedback. If you see patterns, share those patterns back with the class, because that'll help so many of the students who are like, oh my gosh, this is just me, I'm so stupid, I don't belong here. They'll see that other people are feeling the same thing or similar things, and then they'll be like, okay, I guess there's hope. You know, there is hope for me after all. So ask your students and then respond is a good way to do that. Are there any other thoughts on this? And I apologize, we only have like 20 minutes left, so I do want to sort of scoot down, and so I'm going to reinforce that this activity sheet, these resources will be around indefinitely. We have some around from 2015 still, so we don't take them down immediately afterwards. If you keep the link somewhere, you can refer back to it. We keep them editable, so if you have other ideas on this, go in and add them. And that would be a possibility here as well. We might not get to talk about all of the things that we're going to do today, but feel free to add the text to it. All right. How do we dispel the idea that we must teach a lot of content in an introductory science class and instead, I think, spend more time on developing the learning community? This is great. I love this question because it says, how do we set students up to be successful learners versus how do we shove as much content, you know, down their throats as we feel we need to? And in some ways we feel we need to because that next level course is going to require that they have that introductory content, right? So we don't want to let down our colleagues by sending them students that aren't fully prepared. So we have that sort of pressure of, oh my gosh, we have to make sure they know all of this content. In some ways, the content is not so important. It's because if you think about anything that you've learned, that you love, that you're passionate about, was it a fact and a figure that you learned about that? Or was it your love for learning and your ability to find out what the answers are that have prepared you for further education and learning on that topic? So I can't, you know, your next level course people instructors might not like my answer, but I would say teach your students how to connect and support each other and find their passion for that learning, for that discipline, and the next people will love you because they'll have enthusiastic students rather than students who had to memorize a bunch of things. Other thoughts? Prove me wrong. Change my mind. Yeah, go ahead, Jerome.
Yeah, I just want to jump in. I think the question already suggests my answer, but to me, there is not necessarily a tension or a contradiction between teaching content and teaching students how to enjoy learning and developing a learning community. And someone already put in the table something about having clear course objectives. And I think if you work from learning objectives, you can achieve both the goal of delivering content and stuff that students will learn and remember, but also ways in which this can help them grow as learners, grow as people, as citizens. If you have learning objectives that engage these multiple kind of level, not in a Bloom sort of taxonomy type of way. I'm thinking more think and that particular way of thinking about learning objectives, which involve the person as well as the sort of more intellectual engagement. If all of this is folded into the course objectives, you can deliver the content and help your students grow and the course grow as a learning community.
Yeah, great. +1 on that. Are your learning objectives repeated throughout your semester, throughout your activities, and do they align from your activity to your section level or your units to your course official objectives? And can the students grasp onto those? If they're your learning objectives alone, and the students are like, oh, this is a thing I need to do for my instructor, then they're not going to feel like they own it. So as you write those learning objectives, think about how can you write them in a way that the students can be like, oh yeah, I can see the point and purpose in that as well. Angela, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. And Jerome's comment also just made me think about this idea of like a learning objective about learning or like a meta objective or having, not that that necessarily is one of your main course objectives, but those secret course objectives you might have where part of the goal is finding ways to get the students to kind of critique their own learning along the way and critique each other's, in the sense that, like, so I had an example where I had a student this last week where I had some calculations that were totally wrong, and they were wrong in such a, like, to me, obvious way, because they were, it was related to dilution factors and like the number should have gone up. Anyway, it's this whole thing. So it's one of those things where the student was so like nervous about getting the right answer and working through the formula that they forgot to like do a self-analysis check of, well, does this make sense? So having ways to build in that, yes, you're learning things. Yes, you will be able to look those things up even in the later classes and remind yourself, but it's more the kind of conceptual, and can you kind of question your own learning along the way, which I know is like meta and there's not necessarily an easy way. But I think Jerome kind of touched on this too, of like, it's not just the Blooms, but it's also the, you know, absorb, do, practice, where you do the absorption, but then there's the active part, whatever form that's taken, where students actually get to practice and kind of check their knowledge along the way. I think helps pull people in, pull the students into their own learning process as well.
Yeah, one of the taxonomies that Bloom did is also the affective taxonomy, which is how do students respond to it? Do they just respond to it, or do they value it? Do they start to take on that content and see the world through that epistemic lens? And if we can get them to value it and start looking at the world through that lens, our job is done, because they'll just take over. So that's great. Any other thoughts on that? Or a lot of other stuff that we have in the contents here. I'm just going to try to move on to the next one, and then it looks like we might have time for more things as well. All right, this cameras, this is great. And I know that we talked about this a little bit. Tom talked about it. The people in the might have messy backgrounds. They might be having, you know, dogs jump into the picture, or younger siblings jump into the picture. Lots and lots of reasons. And I also want to like emphasize that there are other ways to participate besides having your camera on, where you can see that active participation. One of the things that I think I've got a link down in the activity sheet is the art of the breakout group. Breakout groups, instead of the whole class, you've got a much smaller subset of students. Whether it's just one other person in a pair and share, that you might feel like, all right, this is just one person, I can turn my camera on for that because I trust this person. Trust is another part. If we have built a classroom of trust where our students feel safe-ish with each other, they are more likely to feel like they can volunteer to turn on their cameras. If they fear that, then we have a little bit, I don't know, maybe a little bit more work to do. The Google document that we're working on right now, there's evidence of people participating. It's through text, which is sometimes easier to work on than coming up with thoughts individually. So there's lots of different ways. Google Slides is another one that we can do that as well. Yes, I will find the link to the art of the breakout room, and I will put it in here. Somebody else should talk for a second. Okay, while I do that.
Okay, so John is searching for the link to the art of the breakout room because I asked, so I feel a little bit obligated to
Awesome.
say something now. And I think that question of trust is a really key one. So if we get trust on one level, how, to take Tom's paradigm, can we build on that trust? Even if it's an instructor-student relationship where the student feels comfortable with one thing, how can we add to another thing? And I would also say, do we always need to? Is it sometimes sufficient that students are comfortable unmuting cameras in a breakout room, but not for the class of 500? Particular
All right, so
thoughts there?
So we've got some stuff here on it actually the activity sheet, and I'll put the link in our current activity sheet. But we talked a little bit about this. There's 7 easy ways to structure your breakout group activities that don't necessarily include face-to-face contact, but are very high in interaction. Breakout groups are intimidating, right? They're intimidating because it's always oh my gosh, what am I going to say? We have to do something now. Who am I going to be in the group with? So they're kind of scary. And when we get into those breakout groups, we want to, there's no trust there yet, right? We have to establish trust. Anytime we start a new group, we have to, there's the storming and norming and then performing in a famous group development thing. So what are the things that we can provide our students as instructors to give them these sort of low stakes activities that they all have to do as they interact with each other and build up those trust things? If we just say, go in and build trust with each other, that's too much. But if we can give them some, it's kind of like breaking bread together, right? Or working on some community service work together. The focus is the work, and the side things are where we build those relationships and where we build that trust. Angela and then Jennifer, go ahead.
Awesome. Yeah. So I've been trying to do that this semester with every time there's an activity and we're about to break out, I usually verbally remind, but then also built into the activity instructions are remember to say hello, especially if it's someone you haven't met yet in the class. And my idea is to keep having that reminder sort of even once they're in teams, as a just yes, we're here to work, but we're also human beings, and it's okay to say hi, check in with your group. What are people stressing about this week? Are there midterms next week? Just those human connections that you would do in a classroom. You'd be like, oh gosh, we've got that other class midterm coming up. And so reminding them it's okay to talk about those other things. And then as we're moving later in the semester, we're going to have a more of a research-based project where they're in teams working on research. So group roles is another thing. But even in, I think, small breakout random groups, you can have, all right, pick who's going to be kind of the moderator, facilitator, or who's going to be, who's feeling most talkative today and might be willing to kind of summarize for the group. So having something that they talk about that's not quite the assignment before they get to it, I think is a great way to just make those connections.
We had an active teaching lab on group assignments, group projects a couple of weeks ago. As Jennifer, Tom, and AJ are talking next, I'm gonna go look that up and put a link in there. And I think, was it Jennifer first, then Tom, then AJ? Yeah, I'll figure it out. But you have to unmute, Jennifer.
The phone. Sorry, I keep hitting it on the computer now. I think it's a very good point that it's not enough just to say introduce yourselves. In a repeat group, so there is some familiarity built up. But I also really like structuring in. I have a section where it says, "What would you be whispering about before class? Who has midterms coming up?" Something like that. And then at the end, we do shout out. So-and-so's graduating, so-and-so got a job. I got an A on this biochem that, where we kind of have a wiki inside Canvas and can have some positive things there. To circle back to introductions and building trust, I actually have it really integrated into a project that is scaffolded every week for a folklore and ethnic studies class, where we do a history of French in Wisconsin through a certain number of objects from the Wisconsin Historical Society. Discuss who decides history, who decides what objects are preserved, how do objects tell stories. So the students start off together coming up with what 3 objects would tell the history of Wisconsin, and then they tell the history of their life in three objects to introduce yourself that define you, that are the history of your life. So it gets them thinking about the concept of going to be doing how objects tell stories in this class, but it also gives them a way to say, look, this is my guitar, or so many more meaningful examples that
show and
get
tell
out of the usual. Show, absolutely, it's fun, but it gets pretty meaningful. It builds commonalities, it builds trust without the just, this is who I am and this is my major kind of, y'all get to know each other.
Yeah.
So that's just one idea, and I bet there are a lot of other ones. I will pass it to the next contributor. Thank y'all.
Angela.
Thank you, Jennifer. And I want to build, we're right here in the last 5 minutes, so I want to do some wrapping up thinking. And both Angela and Jennifer, they haven't used these words, but they've both been talking about it. It's the hidden curriculum. Your students do not take any action with you unless you say it's okay. Many of your students don't have models yet for how to be a student in your environment. So saying, go ahead and say hello, make sure that you reach out to your colleagues. Those are hidden curriculum kinds of things for some of your students. And for others of your students, you know, they already know the how to be a student. But if you make that explicit, that is a way of opening up to everybody, and the people who don't need it, it doesn't harm them at all. So make sure as you're thinking about equity, about inclusive practices, that you are thinking about what are the hidden rules that govern the interactions that we have. So I'll pass it back over to who's next.
Go ahead, AJ. Unmute.
I undid my hand, but I didn't do the microphone. No, that was just reiterating, you know, what Thomas just said. I mean, I do that in my very first class. Spend time talking about norms for participation, and you know, letting students know that writing in the chat or writing on the Google Doc is, you know, doesn't get you any more or less points for participation than turning on your video and camera and talking. So I'm very clear, you know, the first day of class, you know, that all forms of participation count. And then model myself those forms of participation. I use a class Google Doc as well. I find it to be a great tool. It's a low stakes way for students to to stay involved. And it's a resource that they can take with them later.
Great. Any other thoughts on that? I'm going to put in the chat a link to a document. It's a link to a Canvas course. Some of you were at this in, what was it, fall of 2019. Marcus Brower presented 20 things, evidence-based practices that you can do for inclusive teaching. Because he presented on a big, what was it, a NIH grant on this. We can't share out the details of that in a document, but through a NetID login in a Canvas course, you can see his course. I'm sorry, you can not see his course. You can see, I think it's for our active teaching lab course that we had, but there's a video of it. So you can watch that. And these 20 practices, things as simple as having your students affirm their values, even only to themselves in your course, even if their values have nothing to do with what your course teaches. Research shows that that helps them succeed in their, not only in your course, but in their academic career. It's kind of cool. There's a bunch of other things that he'll talk about in that talk. So I encourage you to take a look at that. Great. And yeah, thank you for being here, Don. And we have like 2 minutes left. So I want to open it up to anyone else who has any other thoughts that they want to unmute and talk about, whether you're a presenter or a participant. Give it a go. And I want to thank everybody for being here as well. And we're going to talk more about this tomorrow. It might just be me and 1 or 2 other people, but it'll be a good conversation. And we'll be able to dig into these in a little bit more depth. Glad that it's useful, and come back next week. We're going to have more discussions about important things like this in teaching and learning.
And there's a tradition when you're on a live call, even if you have your camera off, at the very end, if you feel comfortable, turn your camera on and wave goodbye to everybody. This is our tradition. So bye, everybody. We'll see you later. It's so much fun to work with you folks and think and do. So take care, everybody. We'll see you soon.
And I'll stick around for a few more minutes if you want to have more conversation. I'm free till 2:30, so stick around and talk to me. We'll have a little office hour type thing right now. Office hours, student hours, participant hours.